Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, December 7th, 2017. Hello again, everyone. I'm Mario Hawani, back inside our New York City studio. You know who else is back? The A-Team. It's been a month since we've had the full A-Team in the house. So excited about that. So let's get into things. That, of course, is Luke Thomas of SiriusXM and MMAfighting.com. That is the man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall of The Ringer and MMAfighting.com. And, of course, that is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of the Washington Post. And I've been noticing that you guys keep switching spots on us. Is there anything to that?
On the three-man booth, I go over here.
We just keep you on. Want to keep you on your toes. We want to make sure you can tell which he's the hat, I'm the shirt. You know, we want to make sure you don't mess it up.
All right. So. Well, it's good to have you guys back. Good to see you again. Much to discuss as always. Let us start with a guy named Max Holloway, a guy from Waianae in Hawaii. And there's a lot that has happened since 218. But for a minute here, I almost want to celebrate Max Holloway. 26 years young, just turned 26, in fact, on Monday. 12 wins in a row. First man to successfully defend the featherweight title since October of 2014. That's 3+ years. First man to, of course, beat Jose Aldo twice in back-to-back fights. To me, he is a breath of fresh air. Everything he says, everything he does is not really reinventing the wheel. He's almost this old school, old soul kind of fighter, but I'm just appreciating him so much in this past year where we've had a lot of headaches as far as champions are concerned. Do you guys share that sentiment? I'll start with you, Luke. Do you kind of share my idea? This guy is just, he is just so much fun to talk to and be around and witness and observe ever since he became champion of the UFC's featherweight division.
Yeah, I think there's a few factors working here. One is that, of course, now featherweight's being cleaned up a little bit. There was all that disarray, and he has provided order with this second victory. He is officially the guy at featherweight, and I think there's a bit of a page turning that's happening that feels fresh. But to your point, in terms of his personality, he's got, you know, he's got the tackiest ties on earth, but they work. They're just so great. And he had the James Bond gold one before, and it's so strange, but it's so he is so utterly genuine, and you can tell it right away. He's never been a phony. He couldn't be a phony if he tried. He's merely just a louder version of himself when he's out there. And then I think lastly, the final component is the guy is doing incredible things in the octagon. If you can get a genuine person who can win and then bring some stability to the larger perspective around them, that's a winner.
There are certain people in the sport that you need to be around them enough to kind of understand a little bit. Like Nate Diaz was one of those guys, although he had the brother, but it took a while to understand who Nate Diaz was and to come around to who he was. Rory McDonald being another guy who kind of stood out after time. You kind of got used to him. But in my mind, Max Holloway is kind of the king of all of that because he seemed so quirky and weird when he came up. And, you remember some of his early fights and just the way he would talk, you know, just that kind of pigeon, you know, sometimes it wasn't grammatically correct. You know, it was just weird stuff coming out of his mouth. And at some point that changes when he starts winning and he's been around, he gets used to the media. He actually cares, I think, about how he's presented in the media, how he's presented himself. He cares to talk to the media and things like that. He comes across as a guy who understands as he goes that is a charm, and he can use that as a charm a little bit. I'm not saying he's manipulative, but he uses it as a charm, I think. He trusts himself to speak how he speaks. And somehow, with the winning and just everywhere he's been, it's one of those weird things that you just see a guy and you're like, wow, you know, this guy's been right on our noses the whole time, and he's one of the true characters of the game.
Yeah, well, he has the belt, and he wears it well. He, on Saturday night, right from the get-go, he looked confident. And I was kind of trying to contrast that to my recollection of the first fight with Aldo, where it seemed to me that in that first fight, Aldo kind of led the dance for for most of the first 2 rounds, and then in the third round, you know, of course, Holloway got him and took him out. And you come away from those kinds of fights thinking, well, did he just wear him down? Did he just get lucky? What happened? There's a lot of mystery to that. I felt there was a lot of mystery to that first fight, and that was one of the reasons I really was looking forward to seeing this second fight, to see if what we saw the first time was real. And this one, it was real right from the start. I mean, I felt as though he was confident right from the get-go, and it seemed as though you could just see Aldo kind of fading under the, I won't say the pressure, but I guess it was kind of the pressure of Holloway. Holloway just came after him in a very calm, poised way, and he wore it like a champion.
And who had more to lose? I mean, obviously, like you just beat a guy, you made it definitive, like you said, you kind of turned the page on the division, then all of a sudden you have an opponent switch. Not last minute, but enough where you're like, okay, now I need to wrap my mind around another opponent whom I've already faced. And just to do it with the kind of aplomb that he did, like he just basically embraced it and went out there and did it. I know you broke down very well, like the different techniques he was using and stuff. Just to be able to do all that, it's just such a compelling story for anybody within the MMA bubble. But I'm starting to think that his charms are starting to get outside of it a little bit too, because I have heard little things now about, you know, it was at the doctor the other day and this guy was like, who's the tall, lanky Hawaiian guy? And I'm like, Max Holloway. And I mean, when you start hearing that, you start thinking like, okay, maybe this guy's getting across a little more at this point.
You know, there's been this trend that has been developing over the past couple of years where someone wins a title and they don't view that victory as, okay, now I'm the king, come at me. It's like, all right, what can I use this belt to get? Like, you know, which super fight is there? What can I demand? It's almost like, you know, the Willy Wonka lottery ticket, you know, the gold ticket, if you will. And he does the complete opposite. He does what we saw, you know, fighters do and say back in 2009 and 2008, I'm the champ, come at me. And he never takes the bait. He never, like, we ask him about Conor, we ask him about going up to 155. He's just, you know, it is what it is, you know, it's kind of silly, but it actually fits him very well because he just doesn't care. He's like, yeah, you want to give me Conor? Great.
Yeah, when
like,
Dana says it's like a shrug off, it's like, it is what it is.
Yeah,
when he says it's like, yeah, that's his personality.
Exactly. Like, you know, even Conor tweeting at him or tweeting a picture of him, I think if it was any other fighter, they would take that as a you know, as a key to walk through the door and say like, oh, come at me, let's have a super fight, let's fight in Ireland, whatever. He's just like, yeah, you're a retired fighter, I don't really care. It's amazing. I mean, that to me is so refreshing, and it's amazing that a kid, essentially, who's 26, has that mindset, and that's why I appreciate him so much, and that's why I wanted to talk about
the word old soul.
It's the old soul, but it's also the confidence.
Yeah.
You know, you don't do that if you're not so confident that if someone wants to come at me, you know, in social media, which is easy to do, but if someone wants to do that, rather than engaging and getting insulted by it, I'm just going to parry it back to you like, you know, you're last year's news. I'm the news now.
Yeah.
And I thought that was
it was a great response.
I think that was his confidence in social media was kind of mimicking his confidence in the octagon with Aldo.
I just think he takes real pride in being the genuine article. I mentioned it from a personality standpoint, but beyond that, you know, you've talked to him a number of times. He says the same thing every time when presented with a different challenge. Not even so much just person by person, but any kind of real challenge as a professional in his line of occupation. He welcomes it steadily and openly. It's the confidence thing you mentioned, and there's a certain amount of like fun about him because he's so welcoming of every conceivable obstacle.
Could you imagine if they could figure out a way of actually finally doing an event in Hawaii? I just feel like he will come across as such a big star. And again, as we've talked about with guys like Stipe, who sort of need that platform to be home and be treated like a star, I feel like that's what will maybe take him over the edge.
Too.
Yeah, I mean,
he talks about it all the time.
I know, he really does. They've never had this many Hawaiians who are actually doing well. Like, they can actually do a Hawaii versus the world card.
There's a little bit of a, you know, you were talking about just, you know, his being a genuine article. I think about that sometimes when we're looking at guys on the rise, and he's obviously been there for a while. We should have probably already seen him in this light, but he's for some reason still feels like he's on the rise. Maybe it's because the Conor McGregor loss, all those fights ago or something like that. But I always think that what it comes down to in some way is being relatable. If you're relatable to a fan, like they feel like they understand your quest. They understand what you're trying to do. They understand what you're about. It translates so differently than a guy who supersedes that or outgrows it. Like Conor McGregor, everybody understood his quest. I think we all felt vicariously attached to his quest until he got big. And then it's suddenly like, you're like, okay, now he's onto a different realm. I mean, that's a whole different thing. It's hard to relate to him at this point, but you can certainly relate to a guy like Max Holloway who speaks, you know, he speaks to everybody the same. He's got, you know, the goal, his mindset and his goals are pretty transparent, you know. It just is, he's a very fan-friendly kind of guy in that sense.
And a humble guy, too, which if you watch the interview in the octagon after the fight, I think Rogan was asking him if this makes you now the greatest featherweight ever. And before Rogan could finish the question, Holloway was already shaking his head and saying, you know, no, this guy, you know, he's basically pointing to the guy he had just beaten and saying, I have a ways to go. I got to catch up to that guy. It's almost like, I mean, if they end up doing this Hawaii thing, I can almost see Holloway saying, yeah, I'm gonna fight in that thing, but put me in the co-main. I want you to feature BJ Penn against somebody, just because that's the guy that is the legend from Hawaii, and he needs to be like the headliner of the thing. I mean, almost that's the kind of thing I can imagine a guy like this doing.
I'm happy he said that, in response to Rogan's question, because it was somewhat of a ludicrous question. I mean, the guy has one title defense, and you're trying to say that he's better than Aldo, even though...
Some would take the bait.
Fair. I even asked him in the post-fight press conference, are you the greatest Hawaiian fighter of all time? And to your point, he said, no, it's BJ Penn. So he's not even going there. It's amazing, though, you look at his winning streak, like, he's in the conversation with DJ, GSP, John Jones, Anderson Silva. Like, that's it. Those guys. That's the Mount Rushmore, right, in UFC history. Do you feel like we appreciate him as much as we should, or maybe the community yet? Like, this guy is in 26, and he's neck and neck with DJ for a winning streak, who's active right now.
Yeah, well, those are partly title defenses, right? So
Sure.
It's a little bit the same with Silva too. It was a 16-fight win streak. A lot of those were title defenses. So I think there's part of it. One is that, again, he's unscrewing the problems that were left at featherweight, so that takes a little bit of doing. So that can impede, I think, people's appreciation for what he's been capable of. But he hasn't had the Aldo fights were unique because, I mean, the McGregor fight was big, but it was when neither was what they are now.
Sure.
Not merely as fighters or promotional acts. He hasn't really had a ton of big fights yet. He hasn't really been on a ton of super big cards yet in these hugely consequential bouts. He's really, which is exciting, he's really at the beginning of that. These Aldo tests, they feel to me like the very first tests of many interesting chapters in the career of Max Holloway. And I think if he gets that Edgar fight, if he goes to 155, let's say he gets a big win at 155, I think then people are going to start opening their eyeballs, because I forget which one of you said it. His style, if you look at him, I think you said it, Jeff, it's composed, and it almost appears plain. Right? You know he can do everything, but it doesn't, he's not TJ Dillashaw who's out there, doing the old Three Stooges, look over here, and then he kicks you in the shin kind of bit. His looks more conventional, which is what is so deceiving about it. There's nothing conventional at all about it other than he makes you think that way. Once everyone catches up to what he's doing, I think that will go away.
Conor McGregor has done a great job of sort of ignoring the UFC, especially, publicly, social media. His tweet about Max, did that give you any indication that maybe he's interested in this fight, that he sees something there, or is that looking into it too much?
I don't know. With Conor at this point, I feel like all of it's just about the same. You know what I mean? Like, you don't really know, like, what's going on with him, but it certainly helps. But like you said, I thought the best part of that whole transaction is him bringing that up, and then Max just kind of coolly shrugging it off. To me, I mean, that's other level stuff right there, because everybody wants to fight Conor McGregor, and he's sort of like, whatever. If you really want to do it, we can, but he's not really, you know what I mean?
I didn't take it as him. I took it as McGregor saying, everybody's singing this guy's praises. I beat this guy.
Okay.
I took this guy. I mean, I kind of took it that way. I don't take it as him like taking the challenge. I mean, first of all, 145 pounds is history for him, I think. And,
right.
But hey, Max is a big dude, so at some point, you're talking about maybe he gets a big fight at 155. Yeah. Maybe the big fight at some point ends up those guys rematching.
That's starting to become slowly like one of the biggest fights they could do. I mean, in a weird way, like, if you just look at where Max has been, his trajectory, and the fact that that was the loss, his last loss, and then you go to where we're at now. It oddly starts to become more important than some of the other fights that were placed with Conor McGregor.
What do you like better, that one or the Ferguson fight?
For Conor?
Yeah.
Man, that's a toughie. I think I would go with the Holloway. I don't know, though. They're both so good. I would love to see either one. I would say that
might be some recency bias.
That's true. That's why I'm saying that.
Right. Right?
Short term, let's see if you agree with this, Chuck. Short term, I'm more in favor of Ferguson.
Okay.
Long term, I'm more in favor of
that's probably true.
Yeah, I'm with Luke, because that is again, it's within the sanctity of a weight class, and I know that the Irish guy doesn't always respect those weight classes, but McGregor, at some point, after 2 years, is going to have to defend a championship if he fights again, right?
Do we all agree that Edgar is the fight that we want to see next for Holloway?
I think the division could really use it. Again, when you have these paradigm shifts from young to old, if the young one can really go in there and just start slaying dragons, a la what John Jones did at light heavyweight. I mean, everyone's like criticizing him for. There's part of his resume is being knocked on. Believe it or not, there's some people who want to say that John Jones' resume isn't as good as it could be because.
What?
Hold on.
Who are these people?
No. They certainly give him his respect, but they also note, I think in some ways fairly, that he beat a lot of older guys. But what I would say is, one, those older guys were still pretty good, and then more importantly, that's almost what you're supposed to do.
He aged them.
Those guys got old when they were in the octagon.
I know what I was going to say. That's what I was going to say. I'm like, basically, he made the division old by just making them, look like yesterday.
Okay, so speaking of older guys who aren't really that old, Jose Aldo's 31.
Yeah.
He is 31 years old, yet for some reason I feel like we view him as like a 38-year-old. Right. And so now comes the time where you start to think of someone's legacy. What should he do? talk about what he should do in a second. But I'm starting to get worried that the 13 seconds really is going to be the first thing that everyone talks about. And that kind of bums me out. Does it not?
I have a theory about this. My theory is that I don't ever root for fighters like I used to anymore. I mean, maybe once in a while, you know. But in Gaethje Alvarez, you couldn't really have a rooting interest because you just don't know what the hell's going to happen. But I was actually, in the end, I kind of thought about it. I was like, I'm kind of glad Eddie won for 2 reasons. One, I don't feel like it hurts Gaethje's stock at all.
Yeah.
And more importantly, Eddie got creamed by McGregor back in, November of 2016?
Yeah.
Now, I know it was December 2nd, but let's say a year later, he had a shaky performance against Poirier, but he got back on that horse against Justin Gaethje, the toughest and the I mean, he's a feral animal, Justin Gaethje, and he weathered the storm and he beat that guy. In other words, he only had about a year of bad press or so before he could turn it around. I don't feel like Jose, yes, he beat Frankie Edgar at 200, but he never really got a chance to right the wrong, and it has stuck to him like a bad smell.
Yeah.
Whereas Eddie had a chance to just completely wash his hand, or not completely, but in a major way, and that's a big difference.
Do you feel like part of the problem is that Eddie kind of owned it? Like, Eddie has talked openly about kind of crumbling under the pressure and how he didn't show up and how it will be a nightmare that will live with him forever. And I feel like Aldo has been somewhat delusional about the fight, which allows people to sort of continue to stick it to him, right?
Yeah, he was to an extent, and you can see why also because, I mean, you could look at it, you could skew it and just say, hey, he was caught. You know, 13 seconds, they went in exchange, he got caught, he went down.
Yeah.
And I think that most people could look at it that way and at least see that side of it. But yes, some of the stuff he was saying seemed a little bit in denial, you know, about the situation. And I think that didn't do him any favors. But I also think that it's because he was the featherweight division, Mike, right? Eddie Alvarez, he was just occupying the space at the time when Conor got there, you know, to fight him. Like, he hadn't had the belt that long, but Aldo was the guy, you know, and he destroyed everybody since 2009, you know, like he'd beat all these guys. So I felt like there was like a magnitude placed on that fight that was a little bit different than the other one, like in terms of who was getting beat there. So Aldo being like the temple and crumbling, it was a whole different experience. You know what I mean? Like, it just felt different when he went down. I can remember the building and it'd be something like, no, who does this to Jose Aldo? I mean, this is crazy. So to me, that's still the reason. It was just such a earth-shattering moment.
So is it actually fair?
I don't think so because, you know, because it was 13 seconds. I feel like it was just one exchange. He got caught. Yes, he was knocked out. I mean, you can't take it away, but if they played it back, would I expect that to happen again? No. You know what I mean? I mean,
that's why to me, the guy who, I'm not going to say damaged the Aldo legacy, because I think Aldo's legacy stands, you know, for itself and is pretty spectacular. But the guy who kind of knocked him down some pegs, to me, is Holloway, really. I mean, a guy can get caught, as you pointed out, that you can come out there and Aldo, of course, you know, McGregor had done most of his leg work before that fight and getting Aldo out of his emotional state, and Aldo came out more aggressive than he should have, gets knocked out, 13 seconds, gone. If he had gone out there after that and beat Frankie Edgar and then demolished Holloway and then, you know, this past weekend was fighting somebody else and beat that guy, I think we would have looked at the McGregor result as a blip on the radar, and maybe we'd be talking about, you know, well, is McGregor man enough to come back and fight him again? Or, like, you know, they would have been throwing it at McGregor and saying, yeah, you did it once, let's see you do it again. But Holloway kind of ended that kind of discussion because he went out there, you know, knocked him out once, and even though Aldo had fought well in the first 2 rounds of that fight, he got him, and now he gets him again and just really took him to task the whole way.
It bums me out, but I don't necessarily think it's unfair because biggest fight of your career that happens, it's going to stick with you. It happens in every other sport, every other athlete. But it feels, it's a little sad that one of the great, I mean, this guy put that division on the map. He validated that division.
It was also just Conor McGregor's biggest moment.
Yeah.
You know, because people were still, I remember you talking about a lot, like, wanted more proof to see if he was going to be, this was his moment, like, that we're like, whoa, Mystic Mac, this guy called his shot, he did it. I mean, there was all of that combines to just make it one of those crazy, crazy things. And I agree with you. You know, it's not unfair because it did happen, but I still think that you got to look at the big picture and see, like, all those years prior to that to judge Jose Aldo.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you're a newer fan and you're trying to appreciate Jose Aldo, there's a lot of ways, you know, coming from WEC to UFC and what he meant for Brazil and the lighter weight guys and all that kind of stuff. But just imagine this. Hard to believe this is true, but it is. In 2009, Jose Aldo fought 4 times in that 1 year, culminating ultimately with beating Mike Brown and getting the title. When he beat Mike Brown, he beat him without any question. That reminded me of the last year that Cody Garbrandt had. Started out unranked. Now, it was a little bit different. He started out unranked. Jose Aldo was always kind of spotted as the next big guy. But then going through and beating Dominic Cruz. Now, imagine if Cody Garbrandt won that contest against Dominic Cruz and then held the title for 6 more years.
Yeah.
That is what we're talking about. That is an insane level of dominance. I actually asked the Fight Venture guys, what stands out to you statistically about Jose Aldo's career? They said 2 things. One, his, 14 wins in a row is second all-time in the UFC Pride Strikeforce WC era behind Anderson's record. And number 2, he has only the 4th best takedown defense rate of all time, which doesn't sound impressive, except it's 93%. And here's the difference. It's the amount. Out of 91 attempted takedowns, he stuffed 84 of them. 84 of 91. That is insane for a guy who wasn't even a wrestler.
Yeah.
He was one of the first guys to really begin to define what it meant to really be a specialist in all the different areas. And so I think a lot of that gets lost in just a 13-second punch.
Yeah, actually, when I think of the Mike Brown fight, the first thing that comes to mind is his takedown defense in that fight. I mean, that was like almost a revelation.
Or taking his back, and there's Mike Brown, another black belt, flailing on the ground as Jose just controls him.
I'd love to see him take a long break and then reinvent himself, or at least try to at 155, because you saw, I mean, I was at the weigh-ins on Friday, and the guy is kneeling over on the scale. Why do that at this point? It's almost aging him, I think. Okay, so that was the main event. And now we move along to the co-main event, and we're all still feeling the effects of Francis Ngannou almost decapitating Alistair Overeem in one of the most brutal.
Funny you say like
vicious...
that, and none of us like.
No, I mean his head actually like cocked back. It was unbelievable.
I thought he was in a car crash. Honestly.
So since then, and this is not necessarily news. I mean, it had been reported by several outlets, including ours, that the UFC wanted Ngannou to fight if he was healthy, if he came out of that fight healthy. In Boston, UFC 220. Well, now they're in the process of finalizing that. So it would be Stipe Miocic versus Francis Ngannou, and then Daniel Cormier defending his light heavyweight title against Volkan Oezdemir. And so I want to start with Ngannou here. And even before we talk about the fight itself, because I want to ask you about the fight itself, Ngannou to me, you know, we know about what he can do. We know about how he finishes. We know about how sort of physically imposing he is. But him showing up to that press conference, wearing what he was wearing, honoring his African nation, honoring his people, honoring where he came from, was almost, to me, it felt like a revelation. He's so different. We have never seen anyone like him in our sport. And, you know, it's one thing to show up dressed nicely, wearing a suit, custom suit, sunglasses. If I were advising him, I would tell him everywhere you go from now on, dress like that, because that will make you into a star. There's a massive amount of people who probably like MMA who have never seen anyone who looks like that, who say, he looks like me, and he talks like me, and I want to support this guy. Don't try to be like everyone else wearing the suit. I feel like the UFC, again, this is not like big news. We all knew he could be a star, but now I feel like they really could have something with him. I feel like he is something special, and especially if he kind of goes that route, honoring his people. I think that's important in this day and age with Reebok, right? With everyone looking the same, to come out dressing like that really distinguishes
Reebok doesn't
you.
make an outfit like.
Yeah, watch them say he can't do that. But do you guys agree that really sets him apart, in my opinion, than just every other, you know, fighter who looks good, who knocks people out? That's a thing that he has that no one else has. It's
the both, right? It's the dance out inside the cage. It's the dance outside inside the cage. I mean, I don't know. There's not much else to say, really. And then outside the cage, I think you're right. I mean, look, whenever, you know, you've been on television crews before, and producers always say the same thing. You know, they always say what people like about MMA is they like the fights and they love stories. You know, they like to know someone's bio. They want to know, where did you come from? What interesting thing, what part of the world do you come from? And you've seen all these things that we've never seen here, or lived a life that is so interesting to us. That's really what you want out of this. And you don't want to turn it into a gimmick, obviously. That would be doing it disservice. But I think you're right. I mean, talking about what this guy is, I mean, what is the antecedent to Francis Ngannou? I mean, yes, there have been other African fighters, and I'm sure other Cameroonian fighters, but not in the way in which he's able to have been so forward with it, much like Max Holloway has been forward with his Hawaiian ancestry. And I think to the extent that they can really accentuate that, or at least, you know, genuinely tell it, hey, sky's the limit.
He marries a lot of elements together. Like you mentioned, him showing up in the African garb. That's certainly a cool thing to see, especially, you know, just him fleeing his home country to find a better life. Him living in Paris, where it's still legal, obviously, kind of aiding that effort, because I know the UFC has been trying to get in there. And then he trains in Vegas now. So it's like he kind of hits all those elements in terms of where he's at, where, you know, his reach. But it's really interesting, man. Like with heavyweights, so many of the people, so many guys, I don't know if it's just because we've recycled the same names for so long. You get so very few guys who come up unscathed. Like you feel like they're coming up, they're destroying, like you're talking about John Jones aging the division. This is kind of what he's doing right now. He had Arlovsky, who we knew was already kind of up there, but Overeem was still on a pretty good run, and he does the same thing to the point where you're like, you know, you look at him and you think that even his big picture scope has always been like, hey, I'm going to be the champion. And now it feels inevitable. And I always love that. I love that kind of thing when you see their mindset come into the play. And it does seem inevitable. You know, he starts out as a favorite when he's going to fight a guy like Stipe Miocic, who's trying to break the heavyweight record of 3 title defenses. All of that, you put that together and it just seems like, wow. Because we haven't seen that. We have never had that guy in the UFC. I know the Fedor has existed outside of it and things like that. We've had Brock Lesnar. The closest I can come up with is like JDS, but he didn't have all those outside elements. You know, he was just a nice guy who could knock people out. But the closest I can come up with who went through the ranks and started knocking people out was JDS coming into that fight with Cain Velasquez. Otherwise, man, I think he's sort of unprecedented.
Yeah, the closest I can come up with is Mike Tyson. I mean, this is a guy that anybody that steps in with him has got to be fearing for their life. The same way that, I mean, I remember some of those Tyson knockouts, and this was very much like that. It was, you know, we've seen guys get clipped and then they get finished on the ground. Well, this guy, you know, Overeem was finished before he hit the ground, and that was just one punch, and it was, you know, what, a minute into the fight, and it was just, I mean, it was about as perfect a scenario as you can get. He just came out there and looked incredibly fearsome, and that is in my mind the selling point, that you've got this guy who's just a octagon killer. Now, if he can also honor his own roots without it becoming a gimmick, more power to him. But I think that would be I would be cautioning him to not try to turn it into. He doesn't want to become a caricature of.
No.
You know, he wants to be himself. But once he gets in there, I mean, really, the bottom line is what that guy produced in the octagon against a trained, you know, elite striker in Overeem. That was damn impressive.
How do you guys feel about the quick turnaround? You mentioned Mike Tyson. You know, part of his success, in my opinion, was the fact that he fought so often in MMA, especially at the top, like when you're fighting for the belt. We're used to you fighting maybe 2 times, 3 times a year. Here he is 6 weeks later getting that title fight. Do you like the fact that he's coming back so soon, or do you feel like they should take more time to maybe, you know, sell the fight?
How soon did John Jones jump in with Shogun? Wasn't that a pretty quick turnaround?
Yeah,
He was a late replacement. You remember it was supposed to be Rashad Evans? But yes.
Because he wasn't nicked up. I almost look at it similarly, because I'm like, you know, in some ways you're like, he didn't really take any damage that I saw. You know, he came out of it unscathed. The only thing is maybe, I was going to say maybe his hand is hurting.
So put a little ice water on his fist.
But ultimately I'm like, hey man, you know, that momentum, everybody just saw that, to just turn it around and say like, now we're going to put that on display against the champion. I like it. I know some people are like, you want to see it built up more, but I'm like, you know what I mean? I think I mean,
how much do you need to build up those two guys?
It just happened.
I mean, look at, you know, I know that Stipe is an underdog in this, which is kind of crazy, but that guy, you know, that guy has gone out there and knocked out people in, you know, first round as well. So we've got 2 guys who are both, you know, if that fight, they should just schedule that for a 1-round fight. Why even have the pretense of calling it a 5-round fight? We're just going to say 1 round for the heavyweight championship of the world. And you know, one of these guys is going to get it, because Stipe does get hit.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the thing. He's gotten hit in some fights and come back and then knocked out the other guy. Well, if he gets hit by this guy, he may not get a chance to come back. On the other hand, Ngannou hasn't really gotten hit by anybody like Stipe either. We haven't seen a guy who can, you know, Stipe is a good boxer. He can move around. He might be a guy who can make that guy miss and put a hurting on him.
This does sound a lot like John Jones. Remember the thing used to be like, yeah, but what is his chin like? We haven't seen him take a punch yet. You know what I mean?
Right.
So Francis has only been doing this 4 years.
I know, exactly.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. Are you surprised that Stipe is the underdog, at least as of right now?
No, there's always some recency. I mean, you knock out Overeem like that, people are going to be high on you. I mean, there's just no way around it. And actually, to your original question, I don't really find. I mean, look, is it an ideal circumstance to have it? What is it in 45 days or something? 44 days now. Probably not ideal, but hardly disqualifying. You know, it's not the perfect circumstance, but what is? It's going to be a great show in Boston if the rest of that card can get together with that Manny Co-Main double feature there. And obviously, this is an easy to promote fight.
Yeah.
But this is a very easy to promote fight. That doesn't mean you don't do a lot. You actually still do a lot, but you get much better rewards for that.
I actually think it worked out well for the UFC because they weren't going to have those guys fight in Perth, and then the next pay-per-view's in March, and that almost feels like it's too far away.
Right.
And I do feel like 2018, especially, the beginning of the year, the first quarter is very important. TV deal. They need to get people excited about stars, right? They need to get people motivated. And so I think they need to put out their best fights possible in the first quarter of the year. And, oh, by the way, they're going head-to-head with Bellator, who are, debuting on this new network, the rebranded Paramount Network. And their card has some familiar names, Rory McDonald, Chael Sonnen, Rampage Jackson. So I think it's probably
all heavyweights. I like that.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's important for them to put their best foot forward here. Can't wait for that. I think it's fun that the light heavyweight and heavyweight title also being defended on the same night. By the way, one more thing about those fights on Saturday. Eddie Alvarez, I feel like it's a no-brainer to do the Dustin Poirier fight. Mm-hmm. Do you guys disagree with that? It doesn't seem like he really wants to do. At least, I mean, that was in the build-up to the fight. Maybe things have changed. Do you want to see that again?
Yeah, of course. There was a shaky, like I said before, shaky Alvarez performance, the unfinished business.
Yeah.
And Poirier getting that win over Pettis in the way he did, also with a mature performance. Both those guys turned some corners since that fight and since a couple of their bad losses. And it'd be nice to see them rematch again, sure.
I agree 100%.
Okay. One of the stories in the aftermath, and this has happened, and I want to bring it up on this show. I try to ignore it sometimes, but since we're sort of like the MMA journalism show, if you will, this happens every few months when the UFC goes to a new market or they return to a market for the first time in a long time. Some columnist for some newspaper will come out and just, yeah, well, I hope not. No. Completely rip the UFC, and it's a bit cringeworthy to read from our perspective because it's usually filled with factual errors or spelling mistakes, etc. And that happened on Sunday. Detroit Free Press columnist writes article completely crapping on the event and the sport and blah blah blah. And so what typically happens when this happens is that the community comes together. It's like the one thing we all, agree on. Let's crap on this guy. Let's call him out.
This guy had no idea what was coming.
Yeah, let's make a show like the tweet ratio, like replies to retweets. There's like 600 replies and 2 retweets. And so sometimes I'm like, why don't we just ignore this guy, right? I mean, like, why do we have to give him any more attention? That's clearly what he was looking for. Why do we get all up in arms? Why do we get so upset about this sort of thing? And so let me start with you, Jeff. You're an old newspaper guy. You've been around these fellows for quite some time. How do you receive this sort of thing? Do you feel the need as an MMA guy to make a show and to call him out? How should we handle these situations? Because I can guarantee you in 6 or so months, they'll be in a new market and they'll go to Perth and some guy will write the same kind of article. Yeah, there's no doubt about it.
I against my better judgment, I did respond to the guy, but it triggers a nerve in me because, as you said, I have a long history in the mainstream media. I mean, many years working for the Boston Globe Sports Department, which is really the gold standard in terms of sports sections of daily newspapers in this country. And for many years, even before I was covering the sport, I watched the sport and I would get kind of ridiculed by my colleagues about, oh, why are you watching this stuff? Of course, this was, 10 years ago when this was happening. And so there is this kind of like thought about from the mainstream media. Now I've moved on and also even today work in the mainstream press. I mean, I'm writing for the Washington Post. Before that was with the Sports Illustrated. So it kind of irks me particularly because as a person who comes from that perspective of the mainstream, I think, let's just do your homework a little bit. And I think that some of the criticisms that this guy had, I can see those having some legitimacy, just not on that night. If you want to criticize a UFC card, that is not the one to criticize. This card had so much that was good about it that to come out and talk about it being sort of boring, lousy production. Like, I understand sometimes being in the arena, when we go to the arena, we're in the front row and we see everything that goes on. But, for some people, up in the upper deck, sometimes you're watching the guys down there, and if you're not technically aware of what's going on in a grappling, it does look like they're just sort of rolling around. You have no idea what's going on. It's hard to figure it all out. I understand that there are limitations to watching an event live in an arena, but on that night, with the fights that we saw that night, that's not the night. It rung out to me like this was the thing the guy wrote that afternoon, and then he updated it at the end of the fights. But basically, he had a theory that he was going to present before the whole thing started, and he just reeled it out there.
What was weird, I mean, at first I thought it was sort of a troll job or something until I realized it was the Detroit Free Press. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Because I saw the headline and it's exactly opposite of the perception that's like the prevailing perception about this being a great card. I was gauging, was this the best back-to-back pay-per-views on record? I mean, that's the kind of card I saw it as. So, like, you see something like that and you think, like, oh, I'm compelled to see this person's argument at that point. You want to know what they're saying. So what sucked about it was you realize right away that he's not an MMA guy. So he's talking about Detroit as if it's like two bubbles colliding. Like he's got Detroit as like this high held, and you're like, that's just a stop for the UFC. They're not going to come any more correct to Detroit than they just did. So that was like it was rubbing me the wrong way in that sense. But also just you get into the types of fights he was watching, and I guess I don't know what the appetite you want, like 12 fights where they're just like literally going out to murder each other with their, I mean, I don't know what would make an ideal card. And in that sense, I'm like, I feel like people are coming to the rescue of the sport itself. They're saying like, hey man, this kind of ignorance at this point, you know, just is almost unacceptable because we've spent so much time over the last decade through the TV deal, everything else, getting it to where, there's education behind it. You know, and that just goes to everybody, all sanctioning bodies and everything, just getting it to an educated perception of what we're seeing, and to see something like that, it just felt like a throwback in time to me.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, he spelled Ronda with an H, you know, all the sort of disqualifying features that, you know, you just can't, I mean, it reminds me of that, have you seen the meme with Principal Skinner? It's it's him thinking, and he says, you could plug in anything, you know, but he's like, it goes, am I out of touch with the popularity of mixed martial arts? No, it must be the kids who are wrong, right? This sort of like old man yells at cloud kind of thing. What do you want me to say? Look, honestly, that's better than what most newspapers would do, which is not even send a guy. Fair. At least they sent a guy. You can attest to that. That's actually not nothing. You know, they sent a guy who's a donk, but they sent a guy. So
they're qualified it better. You can just write it from an admission of ignorance, saying, hey, I don't watch a lot of these. You know, just start it that way.
The one thing that gets me is, we talked about this before, now ultimately Mayweather-McGregor was made, so all of our proclamations that it would never happen turned out to be so smart. However, the one thing that was true at the time that deserves to be repeated was, you know, how are they going to do this deal? And they did the deal ultimately because the parties involved didn't legally get in the way, which they almost historically had always done. They had always gotten in the way, right? Like when Couture tried to fight Fedor. But I mentioned it was like, imagine if, you know, back then, like, you know, RG3 this weekend is just going to play for the Browns instead of the Redskins. Like, they would tell this person, get off set, you're fired. They just never really have an investment to cover the sport in any kind of, and I'm not even using the word sophisticated in its most serious sense, in any kind of adult professional way. And they don't have to because they can get away with it. Well, is really the answer.
I mean, I think also, I mean, the inside story of daily newspaper coverage of MMA is, you know, this is a sport that is on the fringe of the sports world, and what you're going to get is you're going to get a general assignment sports reporter who is being sent out to the arena to cover it and is essentially trying to learn the sport on the run. That's essentially what you're getting.
But it's the same thing, again, just to make a reference, it's the same Onion article. It's like area man overestimates his own ability to fight by 4,000%. It is the fact that you think you can go to a fighting event, an elite level professional fighting event, and you can basically understand what's happening. If that's your assignment, then you need to do your research. You need to actually know how to spell these guys' names. You need to know what you're looking at, to have some degree of erudition about this. Well, the fact that you can get away with it is part of the trouble.
So why don't we ignore it? Why don't we just ignore it? Why do we feel the need?
We're like hockey fans. Hockey fans are the most sensitive losers.
That's my point. God. My point isn't so much, or my question isn't so much like, how do we make this guy smarter, appreciate MMA? Why does it feel like we always have to respond and defend the sport? And maybe we don't. Why does that happen?
I thought it was funny. I mean, I basically read it and I tweeted out that it's like, hey, it's finally a sober voice in a room full of drunks. Basically saying like, hey, here's a sober view, you know? But at the same time, I'm like, I don't get upset. Like some people, you read it and it's very mean-spirited. You're like, man, they're literally upset with this guy. You just have to accept them, like you just mentioned. Like it's just a low.
Maybe because the sport has fought for acceptance for so long.
I had the same thing. I mean, I kind of made fun of the run. I actually said, you know, how do you pay attention to a guy that can't even spell Connor? And I misspelled Connor in the tweet, just to sort of make fun of the fact that he had actually spelled Connor right, but Ron wrong. So I was kind of making fun of it. The only thing that I was taking offense to was, you know, of course, the common response is, well, this is just the mainstream media being a bunch of idiots. And as a representative of that, I wanted to point out that there are people, the LA Times has a guy, the Washington Post has a guy, the Newsday has a guy. There are certain pockets, the Vegas papers, they have people who are in the media who can cover the sport. But unfortunately, in many of the places where the UFC shows up, they are going to get someone who is not really knowledgeable about the sport. And, it's either that or you don't cover it. So you've got to pick your poison.
It's one of those things, too, where, I'm sure all of you guys have had experiences where you've had to explain what the sport is you're covering.
Yeah.
Most people, there's so many people, and I mean people that I know you've said this before, too. There's people around me very close that still don't know what I write.
Yeah.
They still don't even understand what I'm writing about.
Yeah.
I feel like that's one of those things that there's a little bit of that where you see something like, hey, you're reaching a market. This is a sport that's going into a market where we've watched it forever, but the sport's going into a market. It's actually a chance to educate people who may not know what the sport is, in that sense. And just to feed it the other direction, I feel like is always it's just going to rub people the wrong way.
A last thing on this also, I think it also just sort of underscores, I don't know that our audience cares about this. And I think Jeff is right. You got like Adam Hill or Heidi Fang out at the Las Vegas Review-Journal. They do a pretty bang-up job out there. She actually won like a real journalism award recently, Heidi did. So that's true. But I think generally speaking, what newspapers have shown over time is that they are not best situated to cover MMA. If you want to get really good MMA news and analysis, you can get it at newspapers. You probably won't.
Washington Post being one of those.
Yeah, they're not
you know what?
many.
I'm just going to sit over it.
Yeah.
There's not so many.
One last thing on the aftermath. I do think that Ngannou versus Miocic is the best heavyweight title fight that the UFC has offered, probably since Kane JDS1, which you referenced earlier. I mean, it feels like they're all coming together and peaking. I don't know if it's the biggest. I don't think that's accurate to say, only because that one was viewed by 6 million people on Big Fox, and I doubt that this one will even.
And even Brock Lesnar's fights were huge in their way, in that way.
It feels like the best as far as, but not the biggest, if that makes sense.
Well, good thing they put it in a city that's. I mean, there's lots of Clevelanders in Boston and tons of Cameroonians. I just can't wait.
It's a perfect setting for it. Absolutely. Okay, let me ask you guys about the middleweight division. So there's some updates here. GSP did an interview yesterday with TSN in Canada saying, well, he confirmed that he does, in fact, have colitis, that he's suffering from colitis. He also said that he believes that it developed as a result of his overeating and adding weight and such to become a middleweight to fight Michael Bisping at 217. And he also said that he doesn't think that he's going to defend the middleweight title because of how his body reacted to, adding that weight. And so, as a result of that, the UFC appears to be moving on. I reported that they were in preliminary talks to book Luke Rockhold versus Robert Whittaker February 10th in Perth, Western Australia. Not a done deal just yet, but that's clearly the direction they're going in. And if you look at Kelvin Gastelum's Twitter, he would confirm that as well, because he doesn't appear to be too happy with the decision. Let me ask you first about the decision to go with Rockhold over Whittaker, because we all expected, I think, Whittaker to end up on that card.
Rockhold over Whittaker?
Yes, excuse me, Gastelum, my bad. We all expected Whittaker to be on that card because of the fact that he is, fighting out of Australia these days. Gastelum seems to be upset. He has, I think, a case because he's been more active. He does have the loss to Weidman. What do you think of the decision to go with Rockhold over Gastelum?
I wish I could say I have a problem with it. I really don't. I think there's a great case to make that, the Bisping win that he got over Rockhold at 199 was totally legit, but we also know that Luke Rockhold was showing us every indication that he probably is the best middleweight on earth. He seems to be that guy, or at least he's always going to be in the running, at least for now. And he had a great comeback win over David Branch. I understand that some people don't appreciate what David Branch has done in MMA, but that's a super solid win to me. I understand Gastelum and his claim about beating Bisping and beyond, but he did have that loss to Weidman. Weidman I would put ahead of Gastelum for that reason. And so for me, I'm not saying it's the easiest choice, like, oh my God, Rockhold was clear cut, but it's a pretty good one.
I also think that Rockhold, just, going back to 199, those were not ideal circumstances to accept the fight and to change your mindset. I mean, I remember
Max Holloway had no problem.
That's true, but I mean, like Bisping had went through Bisping fairly easily the year prior, and I think that there's a lot of complacency that probably went into that. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but I think you have to look at the whole picture and think like, okay, does that one loss then erase him from that standing? In my mind, he should have probably been up there at some point by now anyway. So I feel like he's been waiting for a long time to get that shot. And like you mentioned, the David Branch thing. So I felt like it was the more natural fit.
Yeah, I kind of agree that it's the better choice, but I don't think it's so. It is not, as you point out, Luke. It's not so clear cut. I mean, really, each guy has won one fight in a row. Neither one is on a winning streak. If they had gone the other way and gone with Gastelum, I probably would have said, I probably would have gone with Rockhold instead, but I wouldn't be screaming it from the rooftops. I think that Gastelum. Wait in line.
You mentioned first quarter. The first quarter meaning something. To me, this is a bigger fight. I mean, you have a guy who's a former champion. Going to face the guy in Perth. Where he's from, in his home country. Yeah. To me, that's the bigger fight. So.
Okay, so should it be for the interim belt or the real belt after GSP's revelation yesterday? Is it time to move on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it really is time. I mean.
There's probably time on whatever, November 3rd, right after the event.
I mean, look, I'm sure his medical condition is real. I'm sure John Danaher told
Some people are questioning it. Do you not buy it?
We live in a world where people think flat Earth is a legitimate theory of existence. Please. I mean, whatever. Look, I don't know what the truth is, but it's a plausible explanation.
Sure.
John Danaher's Instagram post to that effect is a plausible explanation. I have no reason.
What's Danaher's post?
Danaher talked about him vomiting constantly through camp. And
recently or right after the fight?
I think it was right after the fight. Yeah. And I'll put the two and two together.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like I don't have a reason to judge it. What I will say is, though, look, it's not the end of the world for GSP to do what he's doing or for Conor to never defend at 145. But I think we all need to kind of agree it's really not great for MMA when divisions are just abandoned by the guy who's running it.
Oh, yeah.
I don't like it. I don't think it's good. I don't begrudge George for making a decision about his life. But the UFC has to think about this twice. And I understand that we did the post-fight show at 217. You're like, what fight do you want to see next? I was like, Tyron Woodley. And now I'm like, I don't know, man. You're just going to drop the title and you expect UFC to give you another title shot, which you could also then drop and have the same problem again? You got to think twice if you're the UFC.
I mean, I would still give him the Tyron Woodley fight.
Yeah, of course you would.
Because the truth is he is that unique guy, and also he is a needle mover, and he's not quite so like Conor McGregor, but obviously he sells a lot more pay-per-views. Sure. You finally put those two together with Woodley. I think that would be a big event, But at the same time, all what we're talking about is the reason that fight never sat well from the moment they announced it in March up until when it finally happened. It's like, what is he going to, is he going to stay at middleweight? Is he going to defend it? I think most of us probably thought he would not stay there. That just seemed like a bad career move to go fight the monsters behind Bisping. I mean, so it wasn't a surprise. I get sort of in one way you're like, well, this is a convenient timing to have like an ailment. I can understand the hook, line, and sinker theorists are like, oh, we don't want to just swallow everything whole just so he can do this. But at the same time, I feel like GSP, he's justified in doing what he's doing to an extent. It's the UFC. I could see why the UFC would be mad at him, but at the same time, I think they'll get over it just given that you're going to have a big fight with Woodley. If they just make that fight, that's going to soothe a lot of that agitation.
I have zero problem with GSP as long as he goes one step beyond saying, I probably won't defend it ever by saying, okay, I'm relinquishing the belt. I think he said something like, I don't want to hold up the division. Well, you're holding up the division if you keep the belt. I mean, we've seen that already. We've seen that quite a bit. And I think that he needs to say, no, I won the championship. I did what I needed to do. I am relinquishing the belt. And I think that if he does that, give him the shot at his old weight class and let him win that belt.
At that point, it'd be like the middleweight belt, just take like a detour on it. So, the Bisping and USP, and then finally got back to the guys who were all about the picture to begin with.
You asked why we like Max Holloway at the top of the show. I'll tell you why, because Max Holloway is Charlton Heston with that gun. From my cold, dead hands, you're going to wrestle away this belt. That is what fans want. Yeah. I think that is what I want, and that is what a lot of the sport needs.
Does it feel like the UFC almost did a deal with the devil here? Because if you go back to that March press conference, like one of the first questions asked of GSP was, will you defend the belt if you win it?
I have to.
So it was almost like we were all in on it, and then you hear Dana White say, like, if he doesn't defend it, I'll be super pissed. Right. And yes, that was before he came out with the story, with the colitis. So, give him the benefit of the doubt. But can he really be, like, should he be surprised if we were all saying it? What was he expecting?
He's not surprised.
And they did so well on pay-per-view. So, like I said, deal with the devil, use the guy to come back.
He's not surprised. He even muddled up, like, when they were talking, like, you watched his scrum or his luncheon last week. He even muddled up when he's talking about the welterweights. He thinks he's going to find an easier path than the welterweights. And he names a couple of welterweights. And then he all of a sudden names middleweights. He's muddling it all up. And you're like, to me, it's almost like, if you read between the lines even a little bit, you think, well, he's kind of throwing him out there because he wants it to make it look like, you know, Tyron Woodley is every bit as dangerous as the guys he might face there. You could look at it that way, too.
Yeah,
like he's actually setting the table for that kind of stuff.
And if he's making a deal with the devil this time, well, he's been the devil that others have dealt with in the past. How many times have fighters made deals thinking, or been promised something thinking, this is where I win this fight, I get that. And then Dana, like, finds some way to, like, well, we're actually going to do this. It's kind of fair play. That's suddenly now he's the one who made this fight, and now he's...
Well, look no further than Tyron Woodley. On the Wednesday of 214, Dana White is at the press conference saying that Woodley would fight GSP. If GSP comes back, he has to fight Woodley. Fast forward to Saturday, he fought like crap. We're giving it to Michael Bisping. So, yeah, I mean, and it is somewhat ironic to hear someone of his stature in the UFC talk about, you know, contracts and what's in writing, because we all know you could sign an 8-fight deal, lose 1 fight, and you're cut. A lot of things can change along the way. So you kind of, you know, they almost had to make that deal because look at the pay-per-view numbers for 217, or, yeah, 217. But to your point about titles and making them mean something, I also understand why he would be upset if all of a sudden, okay, you came back, we made this concession, and now the belt is somewhat devalued.
Everyone wants to get bitter at Dana, and there's plenty of reasons to get bitter at Dana, but if you were in Dana's shoes and GSP was doing what he was doing, you would be bitter too. It's not unreasonable for him to be like, Jesus, I don't need this headache. He's not.
Although he has a perfect out, honestly, with Whitaker in Perth, it's a great chance to roll him out and make it the real championship. I mean, in some ways, of course, it won't be like the real championship in this linear sense, but at the same time, it's like, you know, it means more, right, than saying, like, here's an interim title fight while we wait to see, you know.
You'd hate to see
this is the nonsense. Dana White's complaint has nothing to do with the integrity of the middleweight belt. It's zero. If it had anything to do with the integrity of the belt, then we would have seen a title defense at 145 pounds by Conor McGregor, which we never even heard one word about how that was going to have to happen until he goes up and he fights for the 155-pound belt.
That's not true. For one night, he was going to fight Frankie Edgar. Remember that?
That's right. Yeah.
But no, like, insistence on that. Then he fights. Then he gets the 155-pound belt. Are we going to insist on he's going to defend that one? Not a word. So suddenly, you know, it's absolutely necessary for GSP to defend his belt when he didn't give a damn about the other guy defending his belt. So it's all about the money for him. It's all about the money fights, and he'll get his money when he gets GSP versus Woodley.
Last thing on this?
Disagree slightly. I think he's right. It's partly about the money. UFC has definitely made a lot of contradictory calls over time, but I maintain this, that you have to take care of divisions for them to matter.
But that's for you. Yeah. I'm talking about Dana White's motivation.
I'm talking about Dana White, too. The UFC is a steward of the sport. They're the most important steward of the sport. If they don't take care of the divisions, who will? Bellator?
But when are they going to start doing that? What are they going to?
That's a great question.
Now we're going to start taking.
No, that's a great question. It's a great question. I agree.
It's almost like they saw this coming as well, because they put that clause specifically in his contract that he had to fight Whitaker, and he's essentially saying, you know, that's not going to happen. Of course, no one predicted that he was going to, you know, get colitis, and that is a pretty serious thing. Like, I know some people are kind of joking about it. I mean, that could be.
I know.
That could be
fans
crippling.
Everywhere. Take some Pepto-Bismol.
Yeah.
That's not.
You know
the
about that, right?
I'm the king of Pepto-Bismol.
Are you still consuming that amount of Pepto-Bismol a day?
Go. Had some yesterday, player.
Not this morning?
No, not this morning.
Usually it's right before the show.
No, not this morning. Me and Pepto go way back.
I want to ask you guys about the other big news from this past weekend, the UFC crowning its very first women's flyweight champion. Her name is Nico Montano, who I think a lot of us never even heard of prior to The Ultimate Fighter. A lot of the competitors on The Ultimate Fighter never even heard of her. They said it themselves. And now all of a sudden, she's a champion in the UFC. Does this feel like a real UFC champion? I'm not trying to knock her, but because she won the belt via the show, and because it felt a little different than Tough 20, where you know, those strawweights who were put on that show to fight for the belt. I mean, Carla Esparza was kind of viewed as like the Jose Aldo of the strawweight division, in the sense that she was the best strawweight. She was the champion of Invicta. That was sort of the de facto, you know, glamour division of the sport for that specific division. But like, this is like the people who were on that show weren't considered the best at 125 for the most part. I know Barb Honchak was there, but you know, the collection wasn't considered the best. I don't know how to feel about it right now. Like, will she only really feel like the champion once she fights a Valentina and beats a Valentina Shevchenko? Because that's what I keep hearing. Like, yeah, wait until she fights Valentina Shevchenko. I know you spoke to her earlier this week. Yeah. Does she feel like a champion to you yet, or does she feel like someone who won a reality show and then was kind of given this prop?
Somewhere in between. I think she realizes, well, the reality show was a life-altering event. She is, I think, quite happy to have the belt.
I would imagine.
But, you know, however long ago she was living in a basement that was, you know, I wouldn't call it deplorable conditions, but certainly some rough conditions. And now all of a sudden she's a UFC champion and she won a reality show. It's a bit heady for her to process. I don't think she's quite processed it yet. So it's somewhere in the middle. But I think there's, you know, look, you made the point, like, you look at the rankings and, like, people you don't really know are fourth in the world at something. And then you look at Invicta this weekend, they've got a flyweight title fight. I'm pretty sure both of those ladies could give Montano a run for money, if not outright beat her. So what is the issue? It's she I think is ready to prove to people, I should say, that she really is. This is more meritorious than you think. But I also think that she also is overwhelmed by the experience.
I do feel like she's hitting the ground right now. Like, this is the one moment where it starts for her.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's the old cliche of the tree falling in the forest. Nobody was really watching the show. I know some people were, but I didn't watch the show. So you didn't know her exhibition record against
You missed out.
Yeah, I know. But, you know, I'm like, but even given then, I think that there was, we talked about this a little bit last week, when they did Tough 20, that was a whole migration of a division, and you knew a lot of the names going in. It felt like you really were looking at the best in the world, so you had to tune in to figure out who was in this division. This one's more cobbled together, and some of them are repeat customers, and there's a lot of them who you're like, you're not sure that they really are as good anyway. It just feels very different. So I feel like for her, it's going to have to be from this moment on. Like, she's going to have to win a couple fights.
That's weird to say about a champion, right?
It is weird to say
Does
that.
it devalue the belt?
Well, I mean, I think last week's show when we were talking about this a little bit, and I think I said something about how this person is a placeholder, whoever wins a belt, and I still believe that, but I do think that they caught a couple of little breaks. One, having the other fighter fall out, and Roxanne Modafferi, for all of her faults, is at least a name that's some degree of MMA fans would recognize, even if they don't know her fights that well. And she's thought of pretty well. So it was nice to see her in that fight. And then the other one was Montano is. I didn't even realize, I hadn't looked at her background, but the fact that she's a Navajo was living on the reservation, that just kind of, you know, it gives a little bit of a story behind who this person is. As a fighter, you know, I think that as soon as somebody for 135 or 115 decides they want to be the champion in that division, I think they can go in there if they're one of the top people and either beat her or at least give her a good fight. But at least there's a little bit of, you know, the UFC was able to capture at least a little bit of a story here.
One thing she did mention to me, I forgot to mention when you first asked me, she does believe there's a little bit of Invicta bias, which is to say, not that Invicta's not an incredible organization, it is, but and they do scour the world for the best talent, including international talent. Nedved is one of and Maya are fighting for the flyweight title. But her point was, I didn't get a chance to go to Invicta, and so I don't have that reputation. I had to build a reputation differently. And so she feels, once given the opportunity to fight some of those ladies who have maybe some bigger names, it will all make sense. But that if you don't have that Invicta bump, to your point, it can be a little bit hard to establish your name.
It is really weird, just real quick, like twice in 1 year we've had basically a stand-in champion, Jermaine Durandamy being the first, who we knew was not going to be the real champ. And I feel like we're in the same situation, but in a different, you know, getting there differently. It's very strange to have two champions where you're like, well, that's just a stand-in until they face so-and-so. Very odd.
Both in the female divisions as well, which is interesting. Before we go, you mentioned Invicta. They have a fight tomorrow. UFC, Bellator, One. Everyone is in action this weekend. Like, all the major promotions are in action. Also, a very busy weekend in the world of boxing as well. If you're a fan of a guy named Lomachenko and Rigondeaux, one of the best fights of the year, that's on ESPN, which is pretty cool. What's the best storyline of the weekend? What do you got? I know these two over here are very excited about this question. Luke?
Fights this week?
Yeah.
The biggest question?
The storyline that you're most interested in sort of seeing how it plays out.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to ruin everything by saying Lomachenko and Rigondeaux is.
Hey, I think that's a valid point.
I mean, it's just the biggest fight this weekend, period.
Yeah.
In any combat sport, and what kind of numbers they can do on ESPN, what kind of gate they can pull. You know, they have this incredible reputation, but they're a little bit of a hipster vandalite. Like, I don't know how exciting that fight's going to be, but I know it's going to be insanely technical, and of course, the 2 gold medalists and why that's history and everything. I will tell you this: the one I'm paying attention to, though, is what is Bellator kickboxing anymore? I really don't even know what it's doing. My hunch is that it has something to do with Spike, Paramount, whatever, and Bellator trying to make inroads into Europe because kickboxing is much more popular there. But you got Joe Schilling on the card tomorrow, tape delay. He has talked repeatedly, how are you going to grow kickboxing in this country if you're not going to be on live? It appears to have no momentum whatsoever, even though it's probably a pretty good product. I really wonder how much longer it's going to be around.
Yeah, I didn't know we were going to be talking about all combat sports either. I thought we were just talking about MMA. Well, I will say that I do dig the fact that Cub Swanson has a platform. You know, just 1 week basically after we get some clarity in like you mentioned before, like the page turns in this division, he has the first real opportunity to make some kind of emphatic statement towards where he should be in that lineup. And same before Ortega, but I'm saying like Cub Swanson particularly because I think a lot of people thought, why wasn't he plugged into that scenario rather than Aldo? So it'd be interesting to see.
Also, last fight on his contract.
It's true. Yeah, that's right.
Wins,
that's right.
Walks away.
So I mean, there's some fun elements to the Cub Swanson thing. If he gets out of that fight, I mean, I would hate to see Frank Edgar kind of shoved off to the side again because he's had that happen a lot in his career. But I feel like Cub Swanson's in a big spot to do something.
Well, the big storyline this weekend is the beginning of the Steve Spagnuolo era with the Giants.
Right.
That's the big one. But if we're sticking to combat sports, I guess I'll think about two guys who both train pretty close to MetLife Stadium over in East Rutherford. That would be Moraes and Aljamain Sterling.
Yeah, great fight.
So bring those two guys from the Metro New York area, at least who train now in the Metro New York area, together on the big UFC fights.
I look forward to Marlon Moraes fights. I don't know why. Like it just is. I always have.
Fun, yeah, this is a huge fight for Sterling. Yeah.
And we're talking about women's flyweight. You got Carmouche fighting
Carmouche first fight in the year
at 125.
Yeah,
at 125.
And you were at that Strikeforce show back when Alexis Davis fought Sarah Kaufman. To me, I still always think about that fight. Do you remember that? It was so back and forth.
Yeah.
One of the better fights that never got sung. It was so unsung, but it was like There's a part of me when Alexis Davis fights, and I know Liz Carmouche can bring it too, that always thinks that there's a chance that could be something special. You know?
I was really very impressed with Eric Anders when he made his debut.
From Alabama.
Yeah, he's fighting this weekend. Mackenzie Dern making her Invicta debut.
125?
No, 115.
Is it 115?
Yeah, she's going back, so will she make the weight?
So that's gonna be
Diaz
fun.
Brother.
What's that?
Southern Diaz brother.
The Southern, Jason Knight. Yes, Jason Knight returning against Mowgli B. So there's something for everyone this weekend. There's something for everyone. Alessio Sakara getting a title shot.
Rico Verhoeven versus
Rico Verhoeven, yes, on pay-per-view. But Alessio Sakara is getting a title shot in 2017.
Against Rafael Carvalho.
Yeah,
right?
how about
the
that?
Nelson Mandela Forum. There you go.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
In Italy.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Okay, that does it for the show. If you're watching us on YouTube, Facebook, MMAfighting.com. But we still have some more time. We're going to be answering your questions now exclusively on Twitter. You know the place to watch us. There's the address right over there. You've sent us some questions using the hashtag DMMA Beat. We've got some good ones, I'm told. So I'm looking forward to that. We call this After the Beat. It's exclusively on Twitter. It's coming up in a matter of moments, so stop what you're doing if you're watching us on YouTube, MMA Fighting. The usual places, go exclusively on Twitter. We'll see you there in a matter of seconds after the beat starts right now.